Welcome, Master Gardeners. I think Roger was going to introduce you guys.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, Roger Whippler with the Ramsey County Master Gardeners. I've been a Master Gardener for over 20 years now, and I guess a lifelong gardener ever since my mother sent us out to the garden with a penny packet of seeds from Gurney Seeds. So we got out in the garden, and then once we were out there, she made us pull weeds. But the whole family now has been gardeners for a long time. So all of us learned how to garden and grow vegetable gardens and flower gardens and the like. So I'll be doing the presenting tonight, and I have Victoria and Christy with me, and they'll kind of help me answer questions when we get to the end of the program. But we invite you to ask a variety of questions, whatever comes to your mind on the subjects that we cover tonight, and we will try to address them. If not, maybe we'll be able to give you some resources. You can do some digging on your own or other ways that you can connect with Master Gardeners. March, April, May, when things start to come alive. Some of what we might have thought we were doing in March couldn't be done because of piles of snow or cold, wet weather. So we got April, and hopefully things will warm up here in the next week or two, and then get even warmer as we move into May. So some of the things we're going to touch on is pruning, starting seeds, tool maintenance, soil care, cleaning up those beds that we have out there. So we'll touch on some of those different aspects, maybe not all of them in this order, but we'll touch on them as we go here. So on a cold, wet, rainy day like this, if you can get outside, maybe you didn't clean up your tools last fall, but now would be a good time to clean up and sanitize those tools, your trowels and shovels and garden forks, getting out there and removing that soil that was stuck to them last fall. Sharpen them if you can. Certainly it's a lot easier digging if your shovel is nice and sharp, or your pruner is sharp, so that when you do get out there to do your work, you're not having to stop and go take care of your tools. And cleaning and sanitizing, just to remove any, because who knows, you might have had to dig out some diseased plant last fall before the season ended. So cleaning up that tool before you utilize it again is a good idea, because it will help prevent the spread of disease and potential problems. Soil, depending upon what it is you're looking to do, whether you're growing a vegetable garden, you may need to reseed some of your lawn, a perennial garden, maybe you want to start a blueberry patch. A good thing to do off the top is to get a soil test. And that test will tell you what type of soil you have, some of the nutritional components from nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium levels that are in your soil, the organic matter percentage, and all those kind of factor in as to what you might need to do in order to grow that vegetable garden, or maybe blueberries, because some of those things take different soil amendments or types that are going to make those plants prosper and be productive during the growing season. So again, adding the amendments, maybe you have compost that you made yourself, or you go to the one of the compost sites in your county, but you can pick up some compost and maybe you add that to your garden and work it into your garden. So those are some of the amendments. Maybe you do a little fertilizer amendment if you're looking to start planting your vegetable garden. And then of course, garden cleanup is something we'll end up doing here in the very near future. We talk about soil testing. Here is a sample of the information sheet that you would fill out if you were sending your soil test to the University of Minnesota Soil Testing Laboratory. And it costs about $17 for the basic test, but if you can see in the kind of middle bottom down there, depending upon what it is you're looking to do. You've got an existing lawn, maybe you want a soil test for what fertility you might want to use. You're starting a new lawn with seeding or sodding. Your vegetable garden, your flower garden. So you would kind of sample the soil from that area that you're going to put in your new vegetable garden. And then the results would come back telling you what things you have in your soil, and then what you might do to improve that soil garden area for your vegetable garden, or if you're looking to grow blueberries, or you're trying to grow azaleas or rhododendrons, because they take different pH soil types. So you may need to do some amendments to help a azalea or rhododendron thrive. So that's why you kind of mark what it is you might be trying to grow there. So the questionnaire kind of helps the scientists who are evaluating that soil sample give you the right information back so that you can plan accordingly. Well, I'd like to say the days are warming, but they haven't been a whole lot lately, that's for sure. And we still will, until the mid-May, have a risk of frost. So you want to be mindful of that before you start moving things out. Perhaps your house plants, or taking some plants, setting out your geraniums or something like that, because the frost can certainly be harmful to those. And the same is true with removing your debris from your garden, your old plant material, because you don't want to uncover things too early, and you do get a couple of warm days, and then you get new plant growth, and then you get a cold snap that ends up freezing that new plant growth. Most plants can handle it, but if it gets really cold, it could damage that perennial that you just uncovered. So you want to make sure you do it in a timely manner and not too soon. You may end up having to do some season extenders. A cloche essentially is a little cover. The fancy cloche I use is a milk carton jug, and you cut the bottom out and you can set it over the top of your newly planted tomato or your flower or a pepper plant. Maybe some of you had cold frames where you do a little bit more serious introduction into your gardening season. Row covers, which just what it says. It covers that row and offers a little bit of protection. Or if you're really serious into gardening, you might have low or high tunnels where you're actually producing garden vegetables, possibly for a farmer's market or something like that. But they all provide some protection from that late spring cool weather and that potential of frost. So when we talk about the annual plants, annuals are the plants that need to start from seed every year. So they grow for 1 year, they are killed by the frost, or they just naturally die because they've completed their life cycle. And we typically, in the garden, flower garden, vegetable garden, we end up with 3 general categories. I guess right now we think of cool season plants first, warm season plants, followed by your tender plants. And your cool season plants are the ones that can tolerate the cool weather. So those could be planted out, hopefully. You can still plant some things in April, weather permitting, but things like radishes, peas, your broccoli and cabbage are some of your cool season plants that can tolerate that cool weather, even a little bit of a light frost. Then some of your warm season plants, green beans, sweet corn, some of your flowers, zinnias, marigolds. They can move out when it's warmed up a little bit, but you still want to make sure that you get them out there not too early so they aren't threatened by frost, because some of those, if they do freeze, they will be dead, and then you'll have to start over. And then we have the tender plants. These are things that are generally tropical in nature, and they generally do not mature from a seed all the way till a harvested fruit. Tomato, for example, is a good example of a tender plant. Generally, we need to start those indoors. So your greenhouses have already got some of them started. Peppers are another good example. Some of your vine crops are very susceptible to frost, so you want to be careful about planting those out until it is nice and warm, like your squash and pumpkin and things like that. So there are the tender ones that you got to be really careful about when you put them out. And typically they don't like cool weather, so they're not going to grow very well anyway. So oftentimes it's kind of like the Memorial Day time frame when we talk about planting tomatoes and peppers out in a lot of gardens, because the threat of frost is typically going to be past and the temperatures are warming up enough so that you don't have to worry about frost, and they are going to begin to grow and take off. One other thing about if you do start your own seeds, you do need to harden them off before you transplant those indoor seedlings. And what hardening off means is you just kind of slowly introduce that plant that you started indoors to the outside, because no matter how good our grow lights are, that is not nearly the same intensity as the sun is. So if you were to take your tomato plant or your pepper plant and set it outside in your garden right away without some protection, it would probably get sunburned and may even end up dying if it gets exposed to full sun. So to harden them off, you're introducing them to that outdoor temperature and gradually introducing them to that full sunlight. I usually take mine out, they're on the north side of the house, so they get some morning sun and then they get afternoon shade, so they're not going to be out in the sun the whole time. And then they also kind of acclimate to that temperature. And then also, if there is a threat of frost, I can move them back into the garage or inside the house and protect them from that potential frost. Perennial plants, removing that old growth. So, and we want to do that once things start to warm up. Usually when temperatures are consistently above 50 degrees is a good kind of rule of thumb. Two reasons for doing that. One is some of that old plant material provides habitat for beneficial insects that have found their way underneath that old plant growth, and they are kind of hibernating and surviving there until it warms up enough. So if we go out and remove all of that old growth, then we're exposing those beneficial insects to the cold temperatures, maybe that 6 inches of snow that we might yet get in April. So you don't want to get out there too early. And the other one I mentioned a little bit is you don't want to uncover things and get them growing and then have them exposed to that cold temperatures. So you kind of want to leave that material on there until temperatures start warming up regularly in that 50-degree range. So, you know, we had those few weeks ago where it was almost 60 degrees. That's nice, but we don't want to start taking things off the first warm day we get. We want to see a stretch where things are going to be pretty consistent on that temperature. Some things you can do is to mulch around those perennial plants. With leaf mulch, something you collected from your yard, or if you put down wood chips or something like that. And in some cases, you can put that right on top of the old plant material. The one reason where you might want to remove plant material as soon as you can is if you were dealing with a diseased plant the previous year. So it got powdery mildew severely on the leaves last year. You might want to get that off and remove it from your garden area because sometimes those diseases will just cycle through and then they'll be right there and present again to start again if we leave that diseased plant material on the ground. But if the plant didn't have any disease problems, sometimes you can just cover that if it's the stuff that lays flat on the ground and just mulch around those perennials. Dividing summer and fall blooming plants. So the rule of thumb there is if it blooms in spring or early summer, you want to wait with dividing until into the late summer. So iris is a good example of a spring, early summer blooming plant that we would divide later in the summer. Your hostas are an example of something you can divide now when you first start seeing them come up. Daylilies, typically, you can divide them most anytime, either spring or summer. So think about when your plant blooms. So if it blooms earlier in the year, you wait till summer. If it blooms later in the summer, like an aster, you can divide those now as well. So, and then fertilizing houseplants. As days get longer, those plants are going to start to grow more. So you can start to add a little bit of fertilizer and follow your directions. Sometimes it's even recommended that instead of using the full dose that the product might say to use, you might want to just do it in half doses for a while and let your plant kind of generally get into full growing cycle again. There on our website is the University of Minnesota Extension website, and for almost anything we're talking about today, you can probably go to the Extension website and find a page that talks about it. So in this case, it's how and when to divide perennials. And Tori will probably have that in the chat room, so you can find that link. But you go to the Yard and Garden page and you look on what it is you're looking for. So how and when to divide those perennials. So and perennials are plants that grow back each year. So they're going to be there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and some last longer than others. Peonies are one that people can have last for many, many, many years, but peonies are also one that don't like to get divided very much, whereas a daylily does better when you are able to divide it, when it gets too dense and too compact, it doesn't bloom as nicely as when it's been divided in smaller clumps. So you can divide to help manage the size of that plant. You can multiply your plants by dividing them and moving them from place to place. I'll put in a word of caution here when moving plants, because we have diseases and pest problems. Be careful when you move and divide and give plants away. Something that might be well suited and does well here in the Twin Cities, moving it up north to the lake place, you don't necessarily want to move disease or insect problems up to the lake place. Jumping worms is something you might want to look up. That's something we're seeing a problem with in some parts of the state. So just be careful about where you take and move plants to. Make sure they're disease-free and insect-free if at all possible. And again, if you have questions about some of the topics we touched on, put them in the chat and we'll try and get to them. Laura, are there anything that we need to address before we go on to trees and shrubs?
We do have one question, and you may have touched on it a little bit, but talking about when to start planting. Do you recommend using a soil thermometer to test the soil before planting?
Yeah, generally, yeah, you can get a soil thermometer. And when we talk about some of those cool season crops, they'll germinate in soils that are 40-degree temperatures. But a sweet corn, a bean, they want to be above 50 degrees. And I know the University of Minnesota had a website, and I think they still do on their climatology page, that actually gave soil temperatures on bare soil, on sod-covered soil. So you can imagine a dark soil surface in the springtime when the sun's shining on it, you will get soil temperatures in that 1 to 2 inches that might be only 10 degrees less than what the air temperature is. So if you got a 70-some degree day, your soil temperatures might be in the 60s as well. So, but a soil thermometer would certainly do that. And just generally, if you can take the soil in your hands and it doesn't make your hands cold and make you feel like you don't want to work with it, then the soil is probably warm enough. But keep that in mind. If the soil is too cold for you to work in it, it's probably too cold for your plants.
That's a really great rule of thumb. And then her follow-up question is, how deep do you have to go for that
Well,
temperature?
generally, most of our plants are only going to be in the, when you're planting seeds, you're probably 1.5 inches might be as deep as you go. But a lot of things are just 1 inch. So it doesn't have to be real deep, but you also want to have some warmth underneath there, because when the lower level warms up, that's going to have the heat for the evening, because those top 1 inches, they're going to cool off when nighttime comes, and they will cool off where you're gradually, you're going to see that lower soil temperature warm up warmer than the upper level. And then eventually, as the whole summer comes along, those soil temperatures will be uniformly warm and stay warm over time. One thing I should mention, we didn't on the annual plants, if you are starting some of your own garden vegetables, starting peppers, you still have time to do that. Tomatoes, it's a good time to get those started. Broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, if you want to try those things, you can start those indoors now. Generally, we don't start things that are the root crops, carrots, beets, things like that. Typically don't do well when you try and transplant them. I know some people have said they've had good luck with beets, but generally it's a little bit more difficult. But so you can start some of those annuals. There's still time to do that.
Great, thank you.
Trees and shrubs. Typically, this is a good time to prune a lot of trees and shrubs. Generally, we'd even like to be out there a little bit earlier. And part of the reason there is right now would not be a good time to go out in your yard after this rain we've had all day, because walking in your garden or across your yard is going to compact the soil. And if you have that heavy clay soil, that's even going to be worse than if you have a sandy, lighter soil. But typically pruning in this early spring is good. One for your trees, as you can see the branch structure and habit, because there's no leaves on it. So you can see where you've got crossing branches. You might hear the term double leader. And that's when you have that one stem, but then at the very top, you have two branches going out like this. If it's a young tree, you should try and eliminate one of those so that you only have a single leader, because oftentimes damage to trees occurs when you have that double leader and then you get a storm. Maybe it's 10 years from now, but that splits because that's not a strong union for your branches, because typically you want a good 45-degree angle on those branches. Anything more narrow, it makes a much more susceptible branch union, if you will. Removing winter protection. Sometimes people have the evergreens and they will wrap them in the burlap. So you want to remove that. Maybe you've had something else helping brace up your tree or a shrub that was newly planted. You might think about removing that material now. It's a good time of the year, as soon as we're able to dig in the soil easily, to plant the new woody plants, trees and shrubs. You will even find what they call bare root nursery stock at some nurseries. And there's no container, there's no ball of soil around it. It's just the tree with the roots at the bottom, and you take them home and you plant them in your site. And it's a good time of the year because it's cooler temperatures early in the season. That tree or shrub can acclimate during the cooler temperatures and begin to establish its root system, and then it'll be in better shape to tolerate the higher temperatures and possibly drier conditions that we see in the summertime. So we do have pruning tree and shrub classes as well. I think those are pretty much done now. And then again, on the university website, pruning trees and shrubs. So we'll prune them for good structure, removing disease or damaged material, kind of controlling size. That's more important on shrubs. It's generally not a good idea to try and control the size of a tree. The best thing to do is plan ahead on what size of shrub or tree you are planting and put it in a position or a spot that it's going to be able to grow in. You don't want to put a tree that's going to grow 50 feet tall underneath the power lines that are only 25 feet above you. So those are the sort of things to keep in mind, or planting it too close to the house where in 10 years it's going to be brushing up against the siding and hanging over the roof. So take into consideration where you plant, and that may eliminate some of your problems that you're going to have later on. So most of your pruning this time of the year, if you are pruning some trees like maple, birch, some of those trees are going to, right now they're out tapping sap from maple trees. So if you prune your maple tree, it's going to bleed, or sap is going to run out of that open wound that you created. It doesn't typically hurt the trees, so not to worry about that, but keep in mind that that sap's going to drip somewhere. So if you don't want it dripping on top of your car or on top of the sidewalk or somewhere on your patio or deck or something like that, you can prune later on in mid-June. You can prune those trees. It may be helpful just to recognize what branches you want to take off, because they're a little bit harder to see once the leaves get on there. So other tips on pruning, we'll do it oftentimes, especially with shrubs, is to improve the flowering. And here's your rule of thumb. If it flowers early in the spring, before the 1st of July, you don't want to prune it now, because if you prune it now, you're going to be cutting off the flowers. So if you were to say, you know, I really ought to take that lilac and cut that down a little bit. Well, you want to wait until after it blooms. So late June, when you see those flowers, the seed pods and the dead heads hanging on there, then you can prune it. Because if you were to prune it right now, you're going to end up cutting off the flower buds. And that's not going to be good if you enjoy the flowers. So the other time then to prune, so you got lilacs, magnolias, azaleas, anything, if it's blooming here in the next couple of months, late April into May, early June, wait with pruning until after flowering. If it is something that blooms after June, you can prune those right now. So if you have spirea, potentilla, viburnums, things like that, where you're not really interested in the blooms, you can prune those right now, and you can trim them down, you can thin them out. Dogwoods are another one. If the shrub isn't known for its flowering, now would be a good time to prune it. One, you can see it well, you can decide what it is you want to remove. So now would be a good time to prune some of those late flowering trees and shrubs. Another good reason why we prune now is because as we get into the growing season, the wound that we create by pruning on our tree or shrub is going to heal over. Because you think about it, the tree is just starting to grow here in April, May, and then it's going to have all summer long to heal that wound before winter comes. If we were to prune late in the fall or late summer, one, we might encourage new growth, which is not good because that new growth won't harden up before winter comes. And two, it doesn't leave a long enough period of time for that wound to heal over nicely before winter sets in. Any questions about pruning at this point in time?
I have a couple. One that I thought maybe would be easy to answer quickly. Do you have a favorite resource for pruning fruit trees?
Apple trees are typically one, and those, if you haven't pruned them yet, the sooner the better on getting those pruned. Typically, we like to see those pruned in March before we start getting insect activity. And that's with a lot of pruning, like oak trees, we don't want to prune them as we get into April here, or throughout the summer because of disease problems. The university has some good information on the pruning of fruit trees as to when and how to prune the apple trees, so that would be a good place to look. Again, you're looking to create good branch structure on your apple trees, because the wider the angle, the stronger that branch is going to be to support the fruit that you're growing. So you don't want those upright and narrow branching structure there. So
sounds good. Thank you.
another thing we started looking at this time of the year is lawn care. And a couple of things you want to do is get your lawnmower serviced, get your blades sharpened. And the reason for good sharp blades is it makes a good clean cut on the grass blade, which reduces injury. It reduces water loss on the grass plant, because you can imagine if it's a ragged, cut that kind of tears the grass blade off versus a nice clean cut, it's going to have more ragged edges from a dull blade. And oftentimes we lower our grass, or lower the blades in the fall to kind of reduce the height of the grass. One, to help us clean up the leaves, and two, also to not leave lots of heavy grass, which could cause disease problems in our lawn. So remember to raise those blades back up, and even more so as we get into July and into the summer, that we want to keep a nice high height on our lawnmower as well. People will be hearing about applying your herbicides, advertisements on TV and radio and flyers in the newspaper, applying new seed. We're looking at a time where people would want to do that. What you don't want to do is to put down pre-emergent herbicides and then put on new seed, because a pre-emergent keeps things from germinating, and it will keep your new seed from germinating. So if you're looking at putting down a crabgrass control as a pre-emergent, don't do it if you're looking to also put some new seed on your lawn this spring as well. So keep that in mind. Also, don't get out there too early. You might hear folks starting to talk about, oh, you need to get out there and do that. But crabgrass isn't going to start to grow till the temperatures warm up. So you don't want to put it on there so early that it's out there now when we've got a ½ inch or more of rain today, which just washes your product away. So you want to wait and make sure that you're putting it on at the right time. Removing or installing sod. Again, this is something we probably want to wait a little bit till we get into mid-May, into early summer, to do sod applications, unless you absolutely need to, because again, you want to put it out there when it's going to have some warmer temperatures where it's going to kind of get it growing right away. This slide has the Minnesota Lawn Care Calendar, and again, you can find that on the university website. And I just saw it referenced in some publication or somewhere just recently about this lawn care calendar, but talks about mowing, crabgrass control. So we're looking at mid-April to mid-May. And like I said, that kind of is temperature dependent. If we don't get any warmer than we are right now, it's going to be closer to the end of April versus mid-April. Sodding in that May through June, and then if you need to do it later, do it in the later part of summer. Watering as needed throughout the summer. Seeding, actually August to late September is the best time to do it. Early spring works as well, except right now you'll also be competing with weeds. We have less weed growth and new seeds of weeds germinating in the fall. So that's why it's more of a better time to seed lawns in that mid-August to mid-September time frame. Fertilizing, again, if you're only doing one application, then if you're not looking for the luxurious lawn, doing that in late summer is your best bet. Or if you do it now in as we get into May into June, probably around that Memorial Day time frame, because you want to put that on when your lawn is going to be actively growing and be able to utilize it. Again, putting it on now would be too early. You run the risk of it just washing away into the streets, into the sidewalk, somewhere where it's not going to be as helpful. Aerating, August to October, dethatching, same thing there. And on broadleaf control, everybody likes to do it in the springtime because that's when they see the dandelions. But actually your September, August time frame works better, because as you think about it, what's the plant doing this time of the year? The energy is coming up from the roots, going up into the leaves. In the fall, it's doing just the opposite. It's taking energy down into the roots. So you get better control when that herbicide you apply is being pulled down into the roots than going the other way. So that's the reason for recommending it in late summer. And then, of course, wildlife. We like to support most of it. There are always a few things like bunny rabbits or woodchucks or insects that is the kind of wildlife we could do without, but we kind of try to have to cohabitate with some of these things. So again, trying to minimize some of that cleanup until temperatures are warmer. That will help some of our pollinators and insects survive and be present when we need them to compete with some of the not so good insects. If you've got a big enough yard, maybe you can create some of those wild areas for habitat, the pollinator garden, a native area that would be, for the birds and other things, because if you have the bird bath in your garden, your birds are going to come in there. They'll eat some of your insects. If you have the water there for them, they'll come there and hang out and maybe help you eliminate some of those pests that you have around. Grow a variety of flowers if you can. Those that flower early in the spring all the way up into October when we see mums and asters blooming. So that's going to provide that food source for some of those pollinators that start showing up as soon as the weather warms up. So you have that whole span of spring through summer if you can provide a variety of flowers, both annuals and perennials. And you can look for the information that tells you which are some of the favored types of flowers and perennials, give you some ideas of things that you might grow to attract some of those pollinators. And then, as I mentioned, that water source. So when we do have to deal with pests, whether they be wildlife, insects, or otherwise, sometimes it's necessary to create the barriers to keep out the things we don't want. This is an example in the picture here of just some netting over some, looks like just some PVC pipe to keep some of the pests out. Maybe it's the Japanese beetles attacking your raspberries or your grapevine or your rose bushes or something like that. Maybe it's the fence to keep bunny rabbits out, or the bigger fence to keep the deer from visiting and enjoying what they find in your garden. But keep in mind, if you're a netting such as this, some plants need pollinators, like your cucumbers, your vine crops, your melons, your pumpkins. So you can't put a netting over them and exclude those pollinators that need to get in there and pollinate those flowers in order for you to have fruit. Not all plants need pollinators, but a lot of them do. So you got to be careful about what you cover up. If you do see insects, sometimes you can remove them by hand. Otherwise, do some looking on the website. We'll also talk about, is this a good bug, bad bug? What can I do to help control it? If you have diseased plants, sometimes the best remedy is to remove it. Just pull it out and get rid of it before it spreads to other plants, because that you can often see happen too, where it starts in one plant and then it'll gradually move down your garden and take out the rest of it. So consider that an option if you have a plant that has a disease and you're not exactly sure what it is, but if the plant's completely dead, it might be best just to get rid of it. And then if you do need to use pesticides, use them with caution, whether they're approved for organic use or not. No matter when you use a pesticide, read the label, follow the instructions, apply it at the appropriate time, because there are times when you can apply that even if you're using an insecticide, it may minimize the potential harm to your beneficial insects if you do it at the appropriate time. So follow those instructions carefully. So as we wrap up spring, you can still do some pruning if you need to do that on your trees and shrubs. You can clean up those tools. You can start those warm season vegetables yet. We're into April, but like I said, tomatoes, peppers, some of those things you can still start and they'll still be in time to get them out in your garden. When the soil dries out enough, you can get yourself a test submitted and get that sent in. Hopefully in next week or two, it's going to warm up enough so that you can get out there in your garden and maybe plant some radishes, carrots, beets are cool season type seeds that you can plant directly in the garden. The little onion sets that you can buy or onion plants are tolerant to cool weather, so those can be started early. If you do want to do some amending to your soil by adding compost, you can certainly do that here before you get into that garden, or if you need to do some mulching on those perennials, you can do that. So planting those new trees and shrubs, as soon as you're able to dig, it's a good time to do that. And grass seed as well. If you need to fill in some patches, you can certainly do that here in April. And then those pre-emergent herbicides. But remember, you can't do the pre-emergent and the grass seed at the same time because your pre-emergent is going to kill your grass seed. So you've started those plants indoors. Now you want to take them out and introduce them to the great outdoors gradually. Don't put them out in full sun right off the bat. Gradually move them into that full sun and cooler temperatures. Divide those perennials if you want as we get into late April, early May. Clean up those garden beds as we get into May. And those tender seeds, warm season crops as we get into mid-May. You can plant your beans, your cucumbers when we start getting the latter part of May, or your squash and pumpkins and things like that, and then transplanting those warm season tender plants, your tomatoes, peppers, outdoors as well. And if you do plant them earlier, you may want to get one of those fancy Cloche milk carton jugs and put them over the top. Take the cap off so that that warm air can escape if you do get a warm day. All right. How about questions?
I do have a few questions. How about I ask you a couple of them and then hold the rest till the end?
Okay.
I'm getting a little bit of an echo here. I'm going to turn this down. Can you hear me okay, Roger?
I can.
Okay. So let's see. Jenny asks, when you mentioned mowing, when mowing the lawn, should I collect the clippings or leave them?
Generally, it's recommended to leave them. The one time where you may want to collect them is if you have a very high maintenance lawn where you fertilize it, you have regular watering, then you may want to collect some of the grass clippings. But if you have what I do, kind of a minimum maintenance lawn, I put the grass clippings right back, mulching mower, and put them right back on there. Unless you have a really heavy crop of grass where you seem to be taking off quite a bit, I will sometimes bag it then, and I'll even use that as mulch. But you don't want to use grass clippings as mulch if you have applied a herbicide to your grass, because that can affect the plants where you apply that mulch. So be careful about that.
Yeah.
So if you do have a high maintenance lawn, you may need to collect grass clippings, but if you don't, generally mulching them back in is the best thing to do, because that amounts to about 1 fertilizer application if you put the grass clippings back on.
Okay, that makes sense. Then following that question is someone who really doesn't want to mow their lawn and is interested in bee lawns. Will you be touching on that in this presentation?
I won't. There certainly are some, you can find some of the, I actually tuned into an NDSU extension webinar last night, and they had a little session on bee lawns. And talking about, you can find some mixes that have the white Dutch clover or some other species that would be suited for the bee lawn. Do some searching on that University of Minnesota website as far as the bee lawns, because there certainly are studies being done on what's going to work best, what plant types are going to thrive best in that. White Dutch clover seems to be the one that typically is low maintenance. It typically grows close to the ground, so even if it's mixed in with your lawn, it will still provide that flower that the pollinators like. But there are some other types too that minimum maintenance and maybe a little bit taller type plants that you could utilize as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So now we'll move into summertime in June, July, August. And well, it depends on what type of gardening you're doing, but there will always be something to do: maintenance, caring for your garden, weeding, harvesting fruits and vegetables, things like that. So one of the first things that you should do is to visit your garden often, daily if you can, you know, because one of the, you can find master gardeners at farmers markets and other places where you can go and ask them questions, and somebody will bring in a sample of a problem. And the first question we might ask is, well, how long has this been going on? And if you haven't been out there for 2 weeks, it's hard to tell someone how long it's been going on, because it may be the tail end of a problem, or it may be just the beginning of a problem, depending on how long it's been out there. So the more often you visit your garden, the more likely you're going to be able to catch things before they become serious, or at least be able to identify them and see if you need to do anything about it. Keeping that soil covered with a mulch is going to, it's going to conserve moisture for you. So if we have a dry year like we did last year, a mulch is going to help conserve moisture. If you don't like pulling weeds all that much, a mulch is going to help control your weed problems and keep them down. And you can do it in your perennial garden. You can do it in your annual garden. You can use mulches in your vegetable garden. So you can use them in any type of garden you want. It just may be different on what type of mulch that you use. You can compost that yard waste. Get yourself a compost container, put it in the backyard somewhere. You can add your kitchen vegetable material, you know, when you're peeling potatoes or you're slicing up that watermelon, those rinds and everything like that can go into your compost. If you do have to bag up your grass clippings, you can compost them in your home compost site. If you are using herbicides, again, you probably want to remove that and not put it in your home compost site. Checking on your garden regularly also helps you keep tabs on when things are ready to harvest, both vegetables and flowers. You can get out there to clip off some of those flowers and bring them into your house, share them with your neighbors. Same thing with vegetables. Picking them at the right time is going to make them taste better. They're going to last longer if you do need to, you know, store them in the refrigerator for a few days if you harvest them at the prime time. And then also preventing those weeds from going to seed. So try and keep those weeds under control so that you can, because they'll take whatever opportunity they can to produce seeds, and that will only increase your problem the next time around. So pulling those weeds and controlling them is going to be helpful in the long run. Extreme weather, both for your garden and for yourself. If you're out there in high heat, be mindful of that. You might want to reduce your gardening time if the temperatures are into the 90s and high humidities. Get out there early in the morning or later in the evening when it's much more comfortable. And then both you and your garden may need more water during those high heat time periods. Typically, if we are talking about watering, the best time to do that is early in the morning. One is there's less evaporation than if you were to do it in the middle of the afternoon or later in the afternoon. And then it also allows your plants to dry off before nighttime comes, because a wet plant oftentimes is more susceptible to disease if it stays wet all night long. Sure, it's going to be covered in dew in the morning, but that dew might not settle in until 3 or 4 in the morning, versus if you watered it at 8 o'clock at night, it's going to be wet from 8 o'clock at night until the next morning. So be mindful of when you water. And then managing that water, that heavy rainfall or drought. If you need to take precautions for drainage when you do have heavy rain, maybe you want to set up your garden so that you have a rain garden, so that the water coming off your driveway or off your roof doesn't run right into your prime vegetable garden, but it's directed away, but still utilized in a more manageable way. A drought, same thing there. Typically, most lawns or gardens will need 1 inch of water per week. That's all. If you have sandy or lighter soil that tends to dry out more, you may need to split that water application over 2 time periods, one early in the week and one later in the week, versus one inch watering at that time. And same thing with trees and shrubs. If they're newly planted, you want to make sure you tend to those during the summertime, even right up until the fall. A lot of times people think, well, it's September, I don't have to water anymore. But if we get some of those severely dry September, Octobers, that can be very stressful on trees and shrubs, because they're going to continue to try and pull water and fill up their root system. And if there's no water down there, it's going to put stress on that tree all winter long. And that's especially true with evergreens like your pine trees, your arborvitaes, because they can lose moisture through those needles all winter long. So you want to make sure you have that soil and that plant well watered before the ground freezes solid. As we look at those annual plants, your flowers and vegetables, maybe you want in your vegetable garden, we talk about succession or relay planting. And that essentially is, I plant my radishes in mid-April here, hopefully. They're going to be pretty much done by the end of May, possibly. So then I can take them out and I could plant carrots, I could plant beans in that space, or just keep that in mind. I'll oftentimes take peas and plant them as early as possible. And then when the peas are done, I will seed in green beans in that same space. So I'm getting 2 crops in that same garden space. Relay planting is planting over the same crop over several weeks. So maybe you want radishes and you plant some every 2 weeks so that you get radishes for a longer period of time. The sweet corn people will do relay planting on their sweet corn. So you see at the farmer's market and you wonder, how can they have sweet corn all summer long? Well, they'll start early and they'll plant every so many weeks in order to have sweet corn, all summer long. And you can do the same thing with your garden as well. Maybe you have 2 different plantings of green beans, or your lettuce or greens. You'll plant some early and then you can plant some a few weeks later, so that you have different stages of growth, and that way you can harvest over a longer period of time. Remove bolting plants. Oh, what the heck is a bolting plant? There are some plants that want to shoot out a seed head. Sometimes beets will do this. Onions will get that little flower on top sometimes and try and produce seed. So sometimes you can either clip that off and that will stop it. Or if it, like radishes will do that as well, they don't end up producing a root or bulb underneath there. They just go to producing flowers and seeds. So if you see that and you don't see much of a radish underneath it, just remove that and get it out of there. But like I say, some other things you can cut that off, like an onion. I'll just snip that off the top and let them keep growing that way. Harvest when ripe. That's another reason to get out there and check your garden regularly, because some things can change rather quickly from being just a day or so too early to being way too ripe or spoiling on the vine before you get to them. So try and get out there. If you can't use it, there's always someone you can find to share it with. Flowers and herbs, pinching or deadheading, and that's what our picture is here. You can see where they pinched off the top of this plant, and now look, we've got two new side shoots coming off of this plant. And you can do that with herbs, are a good example there. Basil, you can pinch off the center part, and you're going to get more branching. Your flowers, zinnias are a good example of one. Impatiens, you can pinch them and they'll get more branching. Salvia, pinch them when they're not real tall, but that will encourage them to send out some additional side shoots and give you a fuller looking plant. So that's something you can do to give you more flowering and a bushier plant. So maybe as we get into that June time frame, you're saying, I'm going to take some of these house plants and put them outside. Again, you know, kind of clean them up before you take them out there. Maybe you add a little bit of that fertilizer before you move them outside. Remember, don't move them into full sun, because that's only going to scorch them, because they definitely don't get that same light intensity in the house that you would outside. So kind of give them a protected site until they acclimate. You can do some cutting them back and pruning some things, your ornamental grasses, your perennials outside, removing some of those spent flowers. Some you can leave on there. The coneflowers are a good example of a flower head that chickadees like, goldfinches like. They will go in there after the flowers have matured and they have seed heads on there, and they'll pick them clean. Monarda is another one you'll see finches on. So some of them you can leave them on there. Others you can cut them back. Generally your annuals, if you remove those dead flowers, they're typically not going to produce much for a seed head, but that will encourage new flowering as well. So, and then divide those spring blooming plants after they're done blooming. You can do that as we get into the summer. Trees and shrubs, typically we don't do a lot of pruning during June, July, and August, but you may have storm damage you need to deal with. Maybe there's some dead or dying material that you need to do away with. Those spring blooming shrubs, the lilac, the forsythia, the magnolia, some of those things you might do some pruning on. And that new evergreen growth, if you want to control the size of your mugo pine, when you get these, what they are called candles, that's the time you want to get out there and you can take off 1/3 to 1/2 of that new growth. And that's going to help you keep your evergreen shrub in a more compact size rather than let it grow out 6 inches to 1 foot every year. You can cut some of that back. But what you don't want to do is cut back into here unless you intend to remove it all, because you get back into where there are no new growth or no green growth. Evergreens typically don't fill in. So be careful about pruning evergreens and cutting too far back close to where there is no new growth. Avoid removing EAB, emerald ash borer. And if any of you have been driving around the Twin Cities the last year, you are seeing trees getting removed here, there, and everywhere. A lot of them are ash trees that have been infested with the emerald ash borer. why you typically do not want to remove them in the summertime is because that's when the borer beetle is active. And if you cut down and remove it, that's just going to cause them to go somewhere else rather than staying on that infested tree. So if possible, remove it during the winter months or late in the season when the beetles don't have a place to go. The other thing to remember here is do not take that wood from an infested tree and haul it up to the lake, haul it out to the cabin, go back to the farm with it because you're going to have a bonfire. That only is going to increase the chances of the ash borer moving faster across the state of Minnesota. It will move fast enough on its own, and Minnesota has millions of ash trees. We don't need to see them get decimated any quicker than what they're going to already. And if you planted those new woody plants and trees, make sure you water them weekly. Typically, you probably don't need more than 1 inch a week, but make sure you keep an eye on them so that they're not stressed during the hot, drier summer months. Lawn care, solarize it. You want to get rid of that lawn? Throw a piece of plastic over it, and that'll heat it up so much that it kills the lawn. When we get into that summer time period, raise that mower height. If we do anything that I see, people cut their lawns way too short. The University of Nebraska was doing studies a couple of years ago about grass height and how often you had to mow it. What they found was that when the lawn was cut shorter, it had to be mowed more often because the grass grew faster. Because if you think about it, when you cut off all those leaves, what does the grass want to do? Well, it wants to replace what was just cut off. So if you cut off less and maintain it at a higher height, you're likely going to have to mow less. It will compete better with weeds. It's going to take less moisture than if you expose all that surface to wind and sun. So try and keep your grass height a little bit higher during those summer months. And then you can lower it back down when we get into the fall and we start getting a lot more moisture, and you want to clean up those leaves and take that grass down a little bit. Keep those clippings in place if you can. Like I said, that kind of adds as a fertilizer application in itself. If you're going to do some seeding, best to wait till late summer. Either if you do it in the springtime here or late summer, you need to keep that seed moist because if it gets out there in a hot 80-degree day and it's just started growing, those little seedlings can burn up real quick like. So you want to keep that moist. So it may require watering right away in the morning and maybe again later in the day when you're trying to get that seed established. And then if you can, want to kill those dandelions and weeds, your best treatment is going to be late fall. Anytime you do the treatments on the dandelions or other weeds, whether it be spring or fall, they need to be actively growing. So if you put it on and it's a cold spell, those weeds aren't actively growing. They're less likely to take in that herbicide. Same in the fall. If we have these extremely dry conditions and those weeds aren't growing, they're not going to take in that herbicide. So those weeds need to be actively growing in order to get your best results from a herbicide. Wildlife support, invite those predatory insects and beneficial insects. They'll help you control some of those pests. Friends like tree frogs can join you and help feed on some of those pests. Birds, adding that flower mix will keep things around. And then minimize pesticides use whenever possible. Will help you keep some of those predatory insects, ladybugs, lacewings. There's some other predatory wasps. They're just really tiny. They aren't the kind that you see flying around at the end of summer. But try and support that, and that'll help you control some of those insect pests as well. Pest and damage control. So getting out there and walking through your garden, it's going to help you identify to say, uh-oh, we got serious problems here. That's one you'd want to yank out and get rid of it immediately. But you can see the one squash or melon plant here is seriously infected. The one on the left looks like it is headed in the same direction. And then these other ones might be next. So it's best if you can get rid of these diseased ones. You know, you might look at this first and think that it's a water shortage issue, but if you know you've been watering it regularly, you may want to keep a close eye on it and see if it's got a serious problem coming in there. This might be insect, it might be disease, so you got to look for both and see, try and identify what the problem is. And if you catch it early, insects, same way, you might be able to control the problem before you have the whole plant dying. Also, if you can minimize soil disturbance around the roots, that's going to help keep your plant healthier, minimize that water loss. So again, if you're removing your weeds, try and do it when the weeds are small so that you're not yanking up great big long pig weeds that are pulling out, you know, that already got roots 6, 12 inches down into the soil. So that'll disturb less of the soil, preserve your moisture, help keep your root healthy underneath the plants you want to have. So getting towards the end here, the summer recap. We get June. I usually, you know, you can, if you've got a perennial garden that already has mulches on it, you can continue to add mulches to it. When I'm mulching in my garden, I typically like to wait till mid-June when you know the soil is nice and warm, because you covered up too soon and your soil isn't warmed up. But waiting till mid-June also means you might have some weeds starting to grow before that. So you can use your judgment as to when you want to do that. But the warmer soil helps get some of those plants started, especially around some of those tender crops like your tomato, pepper, melons, and pumpkins and things like that. You can move those house plants outside, but again, don't put them in direct sunlight. You want to kind of give them a shaded, protected spot from both wind and sun. You can do that succession planting. Maybe your peas are wrapping up by the 1st of July, and you can plant your beans after that. Your radishes are done. You can plant some carrots or something else in there. If you notice insects, maybe you can control them by hand or use high pressure water or something and spray your plants down and get rid of them. Maybe an insecticidal soap will keep them at bay, and you won't have a serious outbreak. And you know, maybe doing a little maintenance will keep them from becoming a big problem a couple weeks later. So those spring flowering shrubs, now you can get out there and work on pruning those lilacs and some of those other things. The thing you don't want to do is wait until late summer, because they're already starting to form those flower buds when we get into the end of July into August. So do it. That's why we do it earlier in the spring. Some of your flowers, you can pinch and deadhead those, removing those ones off some of your perennials, also pinching back some of the annual plants to get them to branch out and flower more. You're going to start seeing some vegetables to harvest as we get into later summer, your green beans, perhaps sweet corn, zucchini. Then beware of heat and drought, both for yourself and for your garden. What do I need to do to keep my garden healthy during that stressful time period? Same with your lawn, newly planted shrubs and trees. Make sure you keep an eye on them during the middle of the summer when it starts to get hot out. You can trim up some of your evergreens. You can actually do that, you know, back here in July on some of those where you're trying to cut that candle and keep it a little bit smaller. Because if you do it here in July, you can almost do that with your fingers and just pinch them and break them off that way. Divide those spring blooming perennials this time of the year. So those iris, maybe the peony. Peonies don't like to be divided too often, so don't make a habit of that, because it may take them a couple of years to start blooming again. Plus, you need to plant them at the same depth they were before. If you get them too deep, it may take them a long time to bloom, or they may not bloom again until they get to that right level. So keep those weeds at bay so you don't get seed heads forming. And then again, the grass or cover crop seed, if you want to put that in your garden, you can start looking at doing that. Or if you're looking at planting new lawn seed, you can do that then. So that kind of wraps things up. I'm going to go through some of these garden resources, and then we can get to questions. And
sounds good.
So I mentioned the Yard and Garden website. You probably got this in the chat as well, but extension.umn.edu, Yard and Garden. And then you can go up in that search box and you can ask about growing raspberries, or what's wrong with my plant? Is this a good bug, bad bug? When's the best time to prune this type of tree? Where's that lawn calendar he talked about? Excellent resources page. They've done a lot of work in updating that, and also has some other links on other locations to find information as well. Ask Extension online tool. So you can go online and ask a Master Gardener, and the Master Gardeners look at those questions, and then they start doing some digging on your topic. So the more information you can provide, the better. If you've got pictures that you can submit, that's even better yet. If you've got a plant problem, it's good to submit, okay, here's what it looks like now. Here's what it looked like when it was healthy, or here's the portion that right where it starts to die off, and here's the healthy, and here's where it's happening in my plant. That helps them identify what might be happening, and maybe get some additional information and help you identify or deal with your issue that you're looking at. So again, it can be any of those questions of when's the best time to do this? Should I be doing this now with my plant? What's this problem? So another good resource to utilize. The soil testing laboratory that we talked about, your texture, structure, nutrient levels, the pH, amendments, as I said, $17 per test. There's the website as well. Actually, Tori, who's on our group here tonight, works in the soil lab. So if you got questions, she'd be a good one to answer them. And as Master Gardener volunteers, you can find us doing a lot of different things in the community, teaching these type of classes, lots of different ones. The educational programs, we work with schools, community garden type things, farmers markets, fairs, other community events, whole different. And we all have our interests, and we will kind of migrate towards those interests. I like the vegetable gardening and the lawn and tree care, so that's kind of up my alley. But other folks are more versed in houseplants and rain gardens and whole different things. So there's typically someone out there who can address the questions that you might have. And then if you're not familiar with the Ramsey County, and I know other counties have these types of sites as well, where you can take your lawn clippings, your leaves, some even take the wood material. So if you have that emerald ash borer, taking them to one of your, check and make sure first that they take them, but they will sometimes take some of that tree and shrub trimmings that you take as well. So, and then you can oftentimes get the compost or wood mulch back from there. So that kind of wraps it up. So questions. And before we do that, would Tori and Christy like to rejoin me and introduce yourself? And
we do have several questions, and I will try to organize them the best I can. So Tori's here. Christy did send a link to a great fruit tree resource for pruning. So I will send that out with our follow-up email with recording of this class and a survey. So recording, survey, the handout, or the link to the resources that Roger has been mentioning throughout the course, and that resource that Christy mentioned. So we have some questions about soil first. So Roger talked about the soil tests, and you kind of talked about the best technique for gathering, or you talked about gathering soil, but what is the best technique for gathering the soil is what Jane is asking about.
Tori, do you have tips on that one?
Sure, yeah. So let's say you want to sample an area that you want to put a veggie garden in. So what you wanted to do is take a trowel and dig down a few inches below the surface and take a few samples from throughout that area. And then take all those samples, put them in a bucket, mix it up, and then send us just 2 or 3 cups from that bucket. And you can send that in just, you know, a baggie that you have or an empty food container. So yeah, that's how you sample.
Okay, great.
And you just don't want your soil to be too wet, do you, Tori? To be.
You know, honestly, we actually do get quite a few wet soils, especially around this time of year. I mean, yeah, it'd be more ideal to have it a little more dry, but yeah, you can send in a wet sample.
Okay, so if they go to the website, they look at, they can print something off from the website that they would send in with the sample? Yes,
that's correct. Yeah, you need to fill out one of our soil testing forms. That was in the presentation, but it's on our website. It's soiltest.cfans.umn.edu, and there's the link for that form should be right on the homepage.
Okay, great. And then following that question is how to refresh soil in an old shade perennial garden.
How to refresh it? Well, adding compost, certainly, and depending upon what soil type you have. I mean, you could certainly find the black topsoil at a garden center too. But adding compost or the topsoil would certainly do that. Of course, you want to be careful how you work that into the soil. I mean, that's the tricky part.
So maybe putting compost on top and working it in around roots a little bit?
Yeah, just kind of work it in gently. And if you got a bigger area where you're moving things in or out, where you can kind of open up one area and kind of amend that and then go back into it. And then the next time you clear out another area or you're dividing or moving plants around, that would be the ideal time to do it. And then you could add in your amendments.
Great. And Ed is asking, can I use compost as mulch?
Yes, you can. Typically you need to put it on a little bit thicker than if you were just maybe applying it to incorporate. But Christy or Tori, have you guys used just the compost mulch as the compost as a mulch?
I have not, but I know you can do it.
Yeah.
It's probably just something where you want to keep an eye on for weeds, because generally if you have well composted compost, the weed seeds typically should be dead, but it's also a good environment for new seeds to fall in there and perhaps start germinating right through what you've just added. So.
Yep, that makes sense. Do you have a favorite mulch for perennial versus vegetable gardens?
I will use straw and sometimes grass clippings on my vegetable garden, making sure that they have no herbicides been applied. Typically, you don't want to use a wood chip mulch in a vegetable garden because wood chips will tie up nitrogen. So the same bacteria that would be helping decompose the wood chips is going to be, what would be helping provide the nitrogen to your plants. So wood chips typically they'll work. Would you agree that perennial beds, wood chip mulches would be fine there because typically you're not disturbing anything, and the nutrients are typically, leaching down into the soil. So
I would
some
add that
people go ahead, Christy.
Yeah, I would just say that I'd also add that a great mulch for your vegetable garden might be some dried up or old leaves. If you have some that from the prior season you find this spring, I always set aside a little pile and then use that. And my preference, I have a rain garden and native gardens, and I prefer wood chips. They just seem to be the best mulch for those perennial plants.
Because even in my vegetable garden, by the end of the summer, the grass clippings, unless I put on heavy straw or something like that, the grass clippings and the leaves are pretty well decomposed by the time the late summer arrives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in vegetable gardens, I think you're mulching to retain the water and keep the weeds down.
Correct.
And then often in perennial gardens, same story, but you're also looking maybe a little more ornamental or a finishing look, possibly.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been using a double shredded mulch that seems to be a nice, easy product to use to work around my plants.
Yeah. The other thing in vegetable gardens that mulch does is it will oftentimes help minimize disease, like around your tomatoes, mulching around the base of the tomato, because many diseases are soil borne. So when the water splashes, it splashes up on the leaves, and then the disease takes hold on the lower leaves of a plant. So mulching can help minimize that in your vegetable garden as well. So
yeah, I'm a big fan of mulching. So I do have a question about tomatoes, since you mentioned them. When is the best time to bring tomatoes into the
when is the best time to plant them?
Yes, to plant them. Well, she says bring them, but I think plant them. But maybe you could talk about it all. So do you want to harden them off and then plant them, or?
Yeah, I typically, even if I'm buying plants from a greenhouse, unless perhaps they're all outdoors, I will not typically plant them into the garden without leaving them kind of acclimate for a few days or a week maybe. Just because of that, if they're coming from inside and going outside, you can burn them up quite easily if you put them out in the hot sun or it's windy. And I guess in the metro area, May 15th, would you agree with me, ladies, that that's probably a typical time? As we get further north, typically it's Memorial Day. I know I had a coworker who, he's just up by North Branch, and he says we don't plant until after Memorial Day because in the 20 years working with him, he said about any time he did plant before Memorial Day, he got frosted. So depending upon where you're at, but the further north you go, the more likely you want to wait until that Memorial Day. I have a garden up at my mother's, and I planted some peppers the week before Memorial Day, and they got frosted last year. So after Memorial Day, everything was just fine. So
yeah, I know. I think we've been trying to move that as we feel like we're moving towards zone 5 a little more. And then was it last year where it snowed? Did you just mention that snowed on Memorial weekend? And so, yeah.
Yes.
Hard to say.
And the other thing they've done research on is that these warm season crops like peppers and tomatoes actually become less productive if they're exposed to these cold temperatures. So they like it to be warm from the time they get out into the garden throughout the growing season. So, so sometimes people say their tomatoes don't produce, and that may be a whole number of reasons why, but maybe if they planted them May 1st and they were exposed to 3 weeks of relatively cool weather, they've been stressed to a point that they're not really feeling like they want to produce. But that is one of the things that been talked about, is they just don't like cool temperatures.
Yep. And on that kind of, and this is a big topic, but have you guys done any outdoor winter seed sowing? And do you have any favorite resources on that? So I think that's the sowing in the milk jugs.
I've tried it. I've got some outside right now. They don't seem to be progressing at all. But I guess that's the whole idea, that we're waiting for the weather to be appropriate for them to start growing. So yeah, and I've just used the milk jugs today. I haven't done a lot with it, but right now I've got some cabbage and broccoli and some red poppy seeds I put out there. I had a little native mix that I sprinkled some out there to see what they would do. How about you guys?
Yeah, I've had great success with kale in milk jugs.
Oh,
So I'm
cool.
gonna do that again. Yeah.
Yeah,
Same
I
for
don't know.
me. Kale and broccoli.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, those cool weather plants, I think we can get going right now.
Right.
I'm not sure if you have much information on the extension website, but MSHS does have a good amount of information in our resource hub. So that's northerngardener.org/resource hub.
Yeah, and there certainly is. I know it's easy to take these webinars and Zoom things now. There's been a couple of different ones I've taken that they've talked a little bit about the winter gardening. I know we had a presentation in our own Master Gardener session a few weeks ago.
Oh, okay.
That's one I missed, but.
Great. So jumping over to, so this was such a great general, like so many topics were covered. And I missed this one earlier, but what do you mean by partial shade? This question.
What was that question again?
So what do you mean by partial shade? What does that mean? How many hours of sun?
I think when they call full shade, it's less than 6 hours, or that might be partial shade.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
I've always thought it was less than 6.
Right.
So,
and I guess the one thing I was going to mention about gardening in general is planting things that are appropriate for the spot, the condition that you're planting into. So planting a peony into full shade is never going to get you a peony that's very productive and flowers a lot. You need to plant plants that are tolerant of shade where you have shade, and plants that need full sun in areas where they have full sun. And same thing with, I live on a very sandy area of Roseville, and having a rain garden just wouldn't make sense for me because everything goes right through the soil to begin with. So planting rain garden type plants, the water doesn't stay around long enough because I literally have feet of sand underneath me. So,
wow.
So you need to plant the appropriate plant in the appropriate conditions. You can't expect a sun-loving plant to thrive in the shade or a water-loving plant to survive a drought.
Yeah.
And I did confirm part shade means 3 to 6 hours of sunlight.
3 to 6. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is kind of a big question, but should I plant in containers, raised beds, or in the ground? So do you have a summary on that one?
Yes. I do all three. How about you, ladies?
I do all three as well.
All three. Yep.
So it depends upon your space availability and how much containers. You can locate them where you have the best growing conditions. You typically don't have to deal with weeds. When I grow tomatoes in pots, I rarely have to worry about disease. So I grow tomatoes, peppers in pots, eggplant, the worm-loving ones, because then I put them on concrete, and the concrete warms up, and they grow a lot faster than the ones that are in the garden. So, other tips or hints that you guys have in the?
I guess I would just look at maybe accessibility as well, like what's easiest for you to to work in the garden and maybe start there, and then what is the outcome you're looking for. If you're, you know, looking, just like Roger just said, if you're really after tomatoes and peppers, you can grow those in all three of those spaces. You're just going to get different production in each one. And I think some of it also depends on your soil type. And do you have soil that might be great for some, you know, vegetables and maybe not others? And how might you grow, you know, maybe in pots for those that the soil isn't the best for?
That's good advice. And correct me if I'm wrong, Tori, if they are going to put a vegetable garden or something you're going to eat in the soil, it's a good idea to have that soil tested before growing food, especially if you're in city spaces.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So with our normal regular test, I mean, that just gives you basic information for fertilizer recommendations. But if you're interested in yeah, growing in a spot where you suspect maybe there is lead paint or close to a busy road, yeah, we do recommend getting the lead test, which is, I think it's on the form, $16 for that. So yeah, we would recommend doing a lead test before starting your vegetable garden, anywhere you suspect like lead paint may have been.
And they even recommend that on if you're trying to grow vegetables close to the house. If you have an old home that may have had lead paint, you want to be very careful about planting things right close to the house or a garage or something like that. So
Yes.
Yeah, good advice. I have just had one come in on pests. How do you control the squash borer? Ew, I hate the squash. Is it squash vine borer? It's terrible.
either of you two, I'm trying to think of there's the squash bug and the squash vine borer. One of them is attracted to yellow. You have the yellow sticky trap that they sometimes use to try and identify them. But I
Maybe
don't
they
remember
can
which
check
one
out.
for sure.
Yeah,
You can
and
go
you know what, that
online.
might be the University of Minnesota website. I know they have some great information out there on the squash borer.
Yeah.
And I know if you find them early enough, you can actually slice into the stem and find the larvae and destroy it
Take it
without
out.
harming the plant. So, but that's another one of those things where you have to catch it early and try and minimize the damage as soon as you see something suspicious, or if you know that it's a potential problem, that you're watching it. And, I think that's some of those sticky traps is to tell you that, hey, they're around. So now we have to be watchful for these pests.
Yep. We have one last question. Thank you guys for sticking around for all these questions. They're good ones tonight. What flowers thrive in shade gardens? Do you have any flowers that you could suggest for shade gardens?
I do. If you're looking for perennials, maybe I'll start with my list for shade gardens.
Go ahead.
A couple that really come to mind, and it kind of depends on what type of soil. So if you're in what I would call more of like a prairie soil, so you're more well-drained soil, I think we'll call it, always, you know, the common hosta, Jack in the Pulpit is a good one. I love wild geranium. It's a lovely shade grower in what I would call well-drained soil. Jack in the Pulpit also likes sort of wet soil as well, so that's always a good one. If you're looking for a shade grower in a little more wet soil, cardinal flower is my favorite Minnesota native perennial. It is so beautiful and it attracts hummingbirds and butterflies all through the season.
Love it.
Tori, you have any perennials that you like the shade?
Yeah, I would say in my garden, I've got a pretty heavily shaded area. And yeah, the things that grow best there are, you know, good old hostas, and then lots of astilbe too. Those two.
Yeah.
Oh, and coral bells is another great one. If you're looking for that kind of darker, rich red purpley foliage with some pastel flowers.
And then lilies of the valley, if you're looking for just something short to occupy space. And that's the thing with perennials, you get a short blooming window and something like that. What is it? Oh, I can't think of it right offhand. But. And then annuals, your good old impatiens are very colorful annual shade lover.
Yeah, those are good suggestions. I love, sorry.
Wax begonias, like shade.
Oh yeah, it's great. I love my bleeding hearts in the spring when they come up. Those are just.
There's the obvious one we missed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, those are all the questions tonight, you guys. Thank you so much. This was such a great class and great Q&A.
Everybody for participating, and hopefully you picked up a few tips. And if you stop and see us, if you see us at farmers markets or whatever, ask us your questions and we'll try to help. So we're generally a very friendly bunch. So
I love Master Gardeners. Thanks, guys. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.